Sunlight poured through the window, turning the dust motes into tiny, drifting stars. Lena sat at her desk, the air heavy with the sharp, chemical bite of turpentine and the thick, earthy smell of oil paints. Tubes of color lay scattered like discarded tools, their caps crusted with dried pigment. She dragged a brush across the canvas, the bristles whispering against the weave. It was a rhythmic, scratching sound that filled the room, yet it did nothing to break the stillness. She stopped. The silence was absolute, pressing against the glass, making the room feel like a sealed vessel. She looked at the empty space on her desk, then at the rows of half-finished sketches pinned to the walls. Every stroke she made felt like a conversation with herself. She tapped her brush against the edge of the jar, the metallic clink echoing once, twice, then fading into the stillness. She stared at the blank white surface of the paper. Her hand hovered, the brush dripping a single heavy bead of crimson. She leaned forward and pressed the tip of the brush firmly into the center of the page. The crimson paint did not soak into the fibers. Instead, it pooled, rising from the surface like a bubble of thick, glossy liquid. Lena pulled back, her heart spiking as the paint shimmered and hardened. It detached from the paper, hovering for a heartbeat, before dropping onto the wooden desk with a sharp, rhythmic clatter. She stared. It was not paint anymore. It was a peppermint candy, striped in red and white, smelling intensely of wintergreen. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and touched the smooth, cold surface. It was solid, real. She looked back at the sketchbook. The circle she had drawn was gone, replaced by a jagged tear in the paper. She dipped the brush again, faster this time, and swept a wide arc across the page. 3 more candies tumbled out of the air, landing in a pile that rattled as they settled. They rolled across the desk, bumping against her inkwell. Lena picked one up, the sugar grit rough against her skin. She bit into it. Lena did not stop. She grabbed a fresh sheet, her movements frantic and precise. She traced the diamond shape of a kite, adding long, flowing ribbons to the tail with a single, fluid motion of the brush. As the last stroke connected, the paper buckled. The painted kite peeled away from the sketchbook, its edges curling as it gained volume. It hovered in the air, the paper rustling like dry leaves. Lena stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. The kite jerked upward, caught by an invisible draft. It banked sharply, missing the edge of her desk by inches, and soared toward the chandelier. She followed it with her eyes, her breath coming in short, excited gasps. It hit the ceiling with a soft thud, then began to flutter. It tugged at the string that trailed behind it, a thin, painted line that anchored the object to the room. Lena reached up, her fingers brushing the stiff, paper-like surface. She laughed, a sound that finally filled the corners of the room. The kite was real, it was flying, and it was hers to command. By the third rainy afternoon, the air in the room had grown stagnant. The kite remained pressed against the ceiling, a static shape that no longer drew her gaze. Lena looked at the pile of peppermint candies on her desk. They were just sugar now, losing their luster as the scent grew cloying. She had dismantled her block towers, the wooden pieces clattering into a heap that held no interest. She scanned her shelves, but every book had been read, the stories inside feeling thin and repetitive. The novelty had curdled into a heavy, predictable monotony. She pushed her chair back, the legs dragging against the floorboards with a dull, grating sound. She walked to the window, watching the rain streak the glass in long, gray lines that blurred the world outside. There was nothing left to do. She sat on the sill, her fingers finding a pencil. She began to tap it against the wood, a rhythmic, hollow sound. Lena remained on the windowsill, the pencil still gripped in her hand. The rain continued its steady rhythm against the glass, a dull drumming that had become the soundtrack of her afternoon. She stared at the floorboards, her mind drifting into the stillness. Then, the rhythm changed. Beneath the steady patter of the storm, a different sound emerged. It was a low, rhythmic thrumming, faint but persistent. She tilted her head, listening. It was not the rain. It was not the wind. The sound was coming from inside the room. She stood up, her feet making no sound on the wood as she moved toward the center of the space. The thrumming grew clearer, a steady, pulsing beat that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards themselves. She knelt, pressing her palm against the wood. The vibration was localized, centered in the dark, narrow gap beneath her bed. She leaned closer, her eyes straining to pierce the shadows. Dust motes danced in the dim light, but the source of the sound remained hidden. It pulsed again, a soft, rhythmic throb that felt like a heartbeat trapped in the dark. A sharp spike of curiosity cut through her boredom. She reached into the cold, dusty void. Her fingertips brushed against something hard and smooth, buried deep in the accumulation of dust. It was not wood, and it was not metal. She gripped the handle and pulled. As it emerged from the shadows, the object seemed to drink in the dim light of the room. Lena held it up, her breath catching in her throat. The handle was cool, yet it radiated a subtle, rhythmic warmth that traveled up her arm. The bristles were not hair or fiber. They shimmered like spun gold, catching the light in ways that defied the gray afternoon. As she watched, the brush began to pulse. A soft, rhythmic glow emanated from the base of the bristles, rippling outward like light trapped in a distant nebula. The intensity of the glow grew with every heartbeat, casting long, shifting shadows against the walls. It was a tool of immense, untapped potential, vibrating with a frequency that made the air around her fingertips hum. The dust on her hands fell away, leaving her skin tingling. She turned it over, watching the golden light dance across the ceiling. The brush was no longer just an object. It was a conduit, waiting for a command. Lena did not wait. She moved to her desk, the brush humming against her palm like a living thing. She dipped the golden bristles into a thick puddle of crimson paint, the pigment clinging to the brush with an unnatural, magnetic pull. She pressed the tip to her sketchbook and swept it in a wide, fluid motion. A perfect circle appeared on the paper, but it did not stay there. The edges of the crimson paint began to curl and lift, detaching from the fibers of the page. With a soft, distinct thud, the circle dropped onto the floorboards. It was no longer a two-dimensional shape. It was a sphere, dense and vibrant, bouncing once, then twice, with a rhythmic energy that defied gravity. As it struck the wood, it left a faint trail of glittering dust, a sparkling wake that hung in the air before slowly settling. Lena dropped to her knees, her eyes wide as she tracked the ball's erratic path across the room. She reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the surface. A surge of pure, unadulterated wonder flooded her. The room, once a cage of monotony, now felt like a threshold to something impossible. The wonder of the red sphere was only the beginning. Lena stood up, her movements sharp and deliberate. She walked to the bedroom door, turned the heavy brass lock, and listened for the satisfying click that sealed her away. The world outside no longer mattered. She returned to her desk, the brush pulsing in her grip, casting a rhythmic golden light. She dipped the bristles into a jar of deep, rich brown, then swept the brush through the air. A cascade of chocolates materialized. She grabbed one, bit into it, and felt the sharp, sweet reality of her creation. Her pulse quickened, a frantic rhythm. She did not stop. She painted a kite that immediately took flight, its string tethered to nothing, circling the chandelier. She watched the objects pile up a horde of impossible things that belonged only to her. Every stroke was a claim. The room was no longer just a bedroom. It was a private sanctuary. She sat amidst the scattered candies, already planning the next thing. The room hummed with the energy of the floating kite and the scattered sweets. Lena sat on the floor, the brush held tightly against her chest, watching the kite string whip through the air. The silence of her sanctuary was absolute, a bubble of her own making. Then, the wood of the door groaned. A sharp, rhythmic rap echoed through the room, cutting through the soft rustle of the kite. Lena froze. The brush pulsed in her hand, a steady, rhythmic light that seemed to dim in response to the intrusion. "Lena, want to play?" The voice was muffled, distorted by the thickness of the door. It was Tommy. Lena looked at the pile of chocolates, then at the kite still circling the chandelier. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She stared at the door handle, watching it remain still, but the sound of his breathing seemed to seep through the frame. The second knock came, louder this time, rattling the frame. Lena scrambled backward, her heels scraping against the floor. She did not think. She dove toward the bed, shoved the glowing brush deep under the heavy wool blanket, and smoothed the fabric over it with trembling fingers. The golden light vanished, swallowed by the dark. She stood up, her breath hitching in her throat, and faced the door. Her hands were balled into tight fists, her knuckles white. She looked at the kite still circling the chandelier, then back at the door, her eyes wide and defensive. "I am busy," she shouted, her voice sharp and brittle, cutting through the silence of the hallway. She waited, her pulse hammering in her ears like a drum. She did not want him to see. She did not want him to touch. Every instinct screamed at her to keep the door shut, to keep the magic contained within these four walls. She watched the handle, her heart racing with a mix of guilt and fierce, protective greed. Silence returned to the hallway, but Lena did not relax. She kept her gaze locked on the gap beneath the door, expecting the handle to turn, expecting a push. Instead, a small, dark shape appeared at the threshold. It moved slowly, sliding across the floorboards with a soft, rhythmic scrape. A half-eaten oatmeal cookie came to rest in the center of the room. Lena stared at it. The edges were jagged, the texture rough, a simple piece of food offered without expectation. "I saved this for you." Tommy's voice drifted through the wood, quiet and steady. The words hung in the air, stripped of any demand. Lena felt the weight of her own harshness. She looked at the cookie, then at the kite, still circling above, its movement now feeling frantic rather than free. Her fingers twitched, a reflexive urge to reach out, to accept the peace offering. She fought it. She took a sharp, jagged breath and forced her heels to pivot. She turned her back on the door, on the cookie, and on the voice. She focused her eyes on a blank page in her sketchbook, her posture rigid, shutting out the warmth of the hallway. She would not be swayed. The house settled into the quiet of the evening. Lena waited until the footsteps in the hallway faded. Then she knelt by the bed. She reached into the dark, pulling the brush from its hiding place. She expected the familiar hum, the pulse of light that always greeted her touch. Instead, the handle felt cold. She brought it into the light of her desk lamp. The golden bristles, once shimmering and alive, looked dull. They were stiff, matted together like dry grass. She frowned, shaking the brush, but the light remained absent. She dipped the tip into a fresh pool of crimson paint, intending to sketch a puppy. She pressed the bristles to the paper, dragging them across the surface with intent. The paper did not ripple. The ink did not lift. There was no movement, no sudden spark of creation. She tried again, pressing harder, her knuckles whitening. The bristles scraped against the grain of the paper, leaving only a flat, lifeless smear of color. She lifted the brush and stared at it. It was just a stick of wood and dead hair. The magic had vanished, leaving her in a room that was suddenly, suffocatingly still. She sat on the floor, the weight of the silence pressing against her ears. Lena refused to accept the stillness. She gripped the handle, her palms slick with sweat, and positioned the tip for a new sketch. She traced the outline of a bicycle, focusing on the spokes and the frame, pushing the brush with rhythmic, desperate strokes. Nothing happened. The paper remained white, the ink drying into a dull, matte gray stain. She wiped the bristles clean and dipped them again, this time aiming for a rainbow. She swept the brush in a wide sweeping arc across the page, expecting the colors to bleed and shimmer into existence. The brush dragged like a piece of dry charcoal. It left behind only a jagged, colorless streak that marred the surface of the paper. She tried to force the bristles to bend, to spark, to do anything, but they remained rigid and lifeless. The brush was a dead weight in her hand. She dropped it, and it clattered against the floorboards, the sound sharp and lonely in the empty room. The silence rushed back in, thicker than before. It pressed against her chest, heavy and suffocating. She sat amidst her scattered sketches, the air stagnant, the magic she had hoarded now completely out of reach. There was no hum, no light, only the oppressive weight of a room that had finally gone quiet. The morning light filtered through the glass, but it brought no warmth. Lena pressed her forehead against the cool pane, watching the street below. Her gaze settled on the driveway. Tommy was there, kneeling in the dirt. He was not creating wonders or chasing shadows. He was simply helping a neighbor tie her shoelaces. The woman laughed, a sound that drifted up through the glass, clear and genuine. Lena watched the interaction, her fingers tracing the frame of the window. The sight of his simple, unburdened kindness struck her with the force of a physical blow. A heavy, hollow ache bloomed in her chest, expanding until it felt like a void. She looked back at her room, at the piles of paper, and the silent, gray brush lying discarded on the floor. Everything she had kept for herself now felt like dust. The room, once a sanctuary of infinite possibility, had transformed into a cage of her own design. She felt the sharp sting of regret, a cold realization that the magic had not just failed, it had withered because it was never meant to be held alone. She stood there for a long time. Lena stood in the center of her room. The silence was no longer a comfort. It was a wall. She reached down and picked up the brush. It felt like nothing more than a splintered piece of wood, cold and lifeless against her palm. She squeezed the handle until her knuckles turned white, then turned toward the door. Every step down the hallway felt heavy, as if the floorboards were resisting her movement. She reached the door to Tommy's room and stopped. Her breath caught in her throat. The hallway was dim, and the air felt thin. She raised her hand, hesitated, then knocked. The sound was sharp, echoing through the quiet house. She waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. When the door creaked open, Tommy stood there, blinking in the sudden light. Lena did not look at his face. She looked at the brush in her hand. She held it out toward him, her arm shaking. Tommy stared at the brush, then at Lena. His eyes widened as his fingers brushed against hers to take the handle. The moment their skin touched, a faint golden spark jumped from the wood. The dull gray bristles shuddered, shedding their matte finish like dead skin, and a soft, rhythmic hum began to vibrate through the handle. Tommy let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "You really mean it?" he asked. Lena nodded, her grip tightening on his hand as she pulled him toward the front door. They did not walk, they ran. The screen door slammed behind them, the sound swallowed by the rush of wind. They sprinted across the lawn, their boots thudding against the damp earth. The grass bent under their speed, and the morning air whipped past their faces, cold and invigorating. They didn't stop for the gate or the garden path. They pushed toward the old willow tree at the edge of the property, their lungs burning with the exertion. The tree loomed ahead, its long, sweeping branches swaying. They reached the trunk, skidding to a halt in the loose soil, both of them gasping for air. The brush in Tommy's hand was now glowing with a steady, pulsing light. Lena took the brush back from Tommy. She stepped away from the trunk, her eyes scanning the open space. She raised the brush, the golden light from the bristles illuminating the dust motes in the air. She began to draw, her arm moving in a wide, sweeping arc. She did not sketch on paper. She painted directly into the empty space. A thick, translucent line of crimson light hung suspended. Lena pulled the brush downward, creating a steep, curved slope. The air began to vibrate, a low, guttural groan emanating from the space where the paint touched the atmosphere. She added a platform at the top, then a set of sturdy supports that anchored into the damp soil. The sound grew louder, a grinding of reality as the light hardened. The structure solidified with a sharp, metallic thud. Lena stepped back, her chest heaving. The brush in her hand pulsed with a rhythmic, golden heat. Lena held the brush out, handle first. Tommy reached for it, his fingers closing around the warm wood. He looked at the empty space beside the slide, his expression shifting from wonder to a quiet, focused intensity. He stepped forward, the bristles leaving a trail of golden light as he began to move his hand in rhythmic, sweeping arcs. He painted the thick, curved ropes, then the wide, sturdy seats. As the final stroke connected, the air hummed. The light thickened, turning from translucent gold to solid, polished timber. The swings materialized with a soft, rhythmic creak, the ropes taut against the morning breeze. Tommy pushed the seat, and it swung forward, slicing through the air with a steady, hypnotic motion. He climbed on, his feet leaving the grass as he surged upward. The swing moved higher, the chains rattling a metallic, musical rhythm. He looked back at Lena, his face bright with a sudden, unburdened joy. He pumped his legs, pushing the swing toward the sky. The brush began to hum. It was a low, resonant vibration that traveled from the handle into Tommy's palm, then up his arm. The golden light, once confined to the bristles, flared outward. It pulsed like a heartbeat, shedding sparks that drifted into the air like embers. Lena watched as the glow intensified, turning the space around them into a sphere of liquid brilliance. The light did not just shine. It bled into the atmosphere, staining the gray sky with streaks of vibrant, impossible color. Clouds that had been dull and heavy began to fray, dissolving into ribbons of gold and violet. The air itself grew thick, charged with a static hum. Every stroke they had made this slide, the swings began to glow with an inner fire. The gray horizon vanished, replaced by a canvas of shifting, radiant light. The willow tree's leaves caught the radiance, turning into shimmering coins of light. The intensity grew until it was almost blinding, a silent explosion of color that forced them to shield their eyes. The world was no longer gray. It was a masterpiece of light. The radiance was a beacon. From the nearby houses, doors swung open, and feet hit the pavement in a rhythmic sprint. Children emerged from every alley, their eyes wide as they locked onto the shimmering willow tree. They slowed as they reached the perimeter, the golden light casting long, dancing shadows across the grass. A girl in the front reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the slide. It felt solid, warm, and real. She looked back at her friends, a grin breaking across her face, and scrambled up the steps. The hesitation vanished. A wave of laughter erupted as the rest of the group surged forward. They swarmed the area, climbing the candy-colored structures. Some hung from the slide, others pushed their friends on the swings, their movements creating a blur of color against the brilliant sky. Lena and Tommy stood back, watching the transformation of their solitary game into a communal celebration. Lena gripped the handle, her knuckles white, while Tommy placed his hand over hers. The brush felt alive, pulsing with a steady, rhythmic heat. Together, they swept the bristles across the empty air. A tower of peppermint sticks spiraled upward, locking into place with a sharp, crystalline sound. They pivoted, painting a wide archway made of stacked gumdrops that shimmered like polished glass. The pace accelerated. Lena flicked her wrist, and a fountain of liquid chocolate erupted from the earth, freezing into a solid, swirling sculpture. Tommy mirrored her motion, drawing a bridge of licorice ropes that hummed as they stretched across the grass. The brush left a trail of glittering dust that hung in the air, marking their path. They did not stop to breathe. Every stroke brought a new detail. Candy cane lampposts, walls of hard-boiled sweets, and benches carved from solid blocks of sugar. With one final sweeping arc, they finished the central pavilion. It stood tall, a masterpiece of impossible geometry, glowing with the golden light. Tommy pulled his hand away from the brush and knelt in the dirt. He traced a perfect circle on the ground, his fingers moving with frantic precision. As he finished the loop, the air inside it shimmered and buckled. A taut, translucent surface snapped into reality, stretching tight between the edges. It was a trampoline. Tommy did not hesitate. He stepped onto the springy fabric, his weight causing it to dip and recoil. He pushed off, his feet leaving the surface, and rose 3 feet into the air. He landed, knees bent, and launched himself higher, again and again. Each bounce sent him soaring toward the canopy of the willow tree. The fabric hummed with every impact, a low, rhythmic thrum that vibrated through the soles of his feet. Lena stood at the edge of the structure, her hands hanging at her sides. She watched him rise, his limbs loose, his head thrown back as he reached the apex of his jump. He was weightless, suspended for a heartbeat against the sky before gravity pulled him back down. He laughed, a loud, sharp sound that cut through the noise of the playground. Lena tracked his movement, her breath hitching in her chest. The sight of his unfiltered kinetic joy acted like a wedge, prying open the tight, guarded space she had kept for herself. She took a step closer. Tommy reached the peak of his arc, his fingers brushing the lowest hanging leaves of the willow. He looked down, his face flushed and bright. "See?" he shouted, his voice ringing clearly over the hum of the structures. "Sharing really makes things better." He landed on the trampoline, the fabric snapping under his weight, and he bounced again, gesturing for her to join him. Lena stood still for a heartbeat, her fingers tightening around the wooden handle of the brush. Then, the tension in her shoulders dropped. She took a step onto the trampoline. The surface dipped, shifting to accommodate her weight. She felt the recoil, a sudden upward surge that caught her off guard. She stumbled, then regained her balance, her feet finding the rhythm. Tommy jumped beside her, his movements erratic and energetic. Lena let out a sound, a sharp, genuine laugh that surprised her. It was not a polite noise. It was loud and bright, echoing against the candy-colored walls they had built. The brush in her hand pulsed, the golden light intensifying, until it spilled over the edges of the bristles, casting long, shimmering shadows across the grass. She kept her eyes on the horizon, laughing as they rose together. The brush in Lena's hand began to vibrate, a low-frequency hum that traveled up her arm and into her chest. She held it out, and the golden light surged, breaking free from the bristles like liquid fire. It shot upward, a brilliant stream of luminescence that pierced the gray clouds. The sky above the park tore open, revealing a canvas of swirling, iridescent hues that pulsed in time with the children's laughter. Below, the light rained down in soft, shimmering droplets, coating the slides, the swings, and the grass in a layer of glowing dust. Every surface caught the radiance, reflecting it back until the entire area was bathed in a blinding, warm brilliance. Children looked up, their faces illuminated by the shifting patterns of light as they scrambled across the structures. The park became a living, breathing mural, its colors shifting from deep violet to blinding gold as the brush continued to paint the very atmosphere. Lena stepped off the trampoline, her boots sinking into the soft, glowing grass. She walked to the edge of the clearing, the brush hanging loosely at her side. A group of children raced past her, their hands outstretched to touch the shimmering slide. She watched a boy trace the golden patterns on the structure, his eyes wide, his fingers leaving trails of light in the air. Further away, Tommy was helping a smaller child navigate the swings, his movements steady and patient. Lena looked down at the brush. The bristles were still warm, humming with a soft, rhythmic pulse that matched the cadence of the laughter around her. She realized then that the magic had never been meant to stay behind a locked door. It had been waiting for this exact moment for the noise, the movement, and the shared discovery. She saw a girl pick up a fallen scrap of glowing paint from the ground and press it against her palm, watching it bloom into a star-shaped pattern. The girl turned and showed it to her friends, and the group erupted in cheers. Lena leaned against the trunk of the willow tree, watching the chaos of happy children. She did not tighten her grip on the handle. She let it rest in her palm, open and exposed. The brush was a catalyst, a bridge between her solitary world and the vibrant life of the park. Lena walked back into her room, the door clicking shut behind her. The space was still, the afternoon light casting long, thin shadows across the floorboards. She sat on the edge of her bed and pulled the brush from her pocket. She held it up to the fading sunlight, her fingers tracing the wooden handle. She expected the bristles to be gray and stiff, a remnant of her earlier selfishness. Instead, they caught the light and flared. A deep, golden luminescence rippled through the fibers, pulsing with a steady, heartbeat rhythm. She brushed them against her palm, and a faint trail of glitter clung to her skin, shimmering in the dim air. The brush was not just alive. It was vibrant, more intense than it had been when she first discovered it under the bed. The brush was waiting, its light steady and bright, ready for whatever she chose to create next. Lena stood up and walked to her desk, pulling open the bottom drawer. She pushed aside old sketches and dried up tubes of paint until her fingers brushed against a small cedar box. It was smooth, sanded down by years of use, and smelled faintly of pine. She set the box on the desk and cleared a space. She picked up the brush one last time, watching the golden light dance across the grain of the lid. She reached for a small metal chisel, the steel cold against her skin. With steady hands, she pressed the point into the wood. She carved the first letter, then the next, the wood shavings curling away like tiny ribbons, for sharing only. She placed the brush inside the box. The bristles settled against the velvet lining, the golden glow dimming to a soft, steady hum. She closed the lid. The latch clicked shut with a solid, final sound. The secret was gone. The responsibility remained. Lena sat back in her chair, watching the sunlight play across the cedar lid. The box sat motionless, yet the faint, golden hum vibrating from within seemed to pulse in time with her own breathing. She stood and walked to the window, pushing the glass pane wide. A cool breeze drifted in, carrying the scent of damp earth and the distant, fading echoes of children playing in the park. She looked down at the street where Tommy was still visible, walking toward the willow tree. The weight of the secret she had once guarded had evaporated, replaced by a lightness that settled deep in her chest. She realized then that the magic was not a finite resource to be locked away, but a flame that grew brighter the more it was passed. She turned back to the desk and laid her hand gently on the box. It was no longer a cage for her power, but a vessel. She smiled, a quiet, genuine expression of contentment, and left the window open, letting the world in.